Today I will be looking at a story by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, adapted into manga format by Gou Tanabe. There's a lot that could be said about HP Lovecraft that I won't get into here, save that he's arguably one of, if not the most influential American horror writers of the 20th century, and his appeal goes beyond the States. Famed horror manga creator Junji Ito has said he considered doing adaptations of Lovecraft's work, at least before Gou Tanabe did it first. As for Gou Tanabe, he is a big fan of Lovecraft who has adapted many of his stories into the manga format over the past decade. Lovecraft's work is in the public domain, by the way. He even tries his hand at some of Lovecraft's purple prose in his note at the end of the volume I'm looking at today. A sleepless night, a presence at the door, a whispering barely heard, an anxiety and fear such as you haven't felt since you were young, an intuition of primordial death. Lovecraft was a writer who crafted such unknowable darkness, a priest of his own mythos. I know fear even at the richness of his creativity. By illustrating his stories, I intend to become an apostle of the gods he made. I do not feel my work is yet complete. The images swell in my mind. If I draw like this, if I do it this way. I hear the divine voice commanding me to continue. I am blessed that you are reading this. You have my gratitude. Gou Tanabe, 2014. Okay, maybe sounding a little too much like an unstable Lovecraft protagonist, but clearly he's a fan. The specific story we will be looking at today was one of Lovecraft's earlier works. The Temple was written in 1920, not long after the end of the First World War, and published in Weird Tales magazine in 1925. Lovecraft himself was apparently rejected for service during the war due to poor health. The manga adaptation is found in HP Lovecraft's The Hound and Other Stories, a collection of 3 Lovecraft short stories that Gou Tanabe has adapted. Without further preamble, let's get into The Temple. Our story is told from the perspective of one Karl Heinrich in command of German U-boat U-29. He is a Graf, which is a title of German nobility usually translated as Count. On the afternoon of June 18th, they sank the British freighter Victory in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Karl watches it sink below the waves from his surface submarine. Now you'll notice the most notable change to this story from what H.P. Lovecraft wrote waving behind Karl. Yep, a great big swastika. I really hope this doesn't hurt me in the algorithm. As I said, Lovecraft wrote this in 1920, setting it some years earlier during World War I, long before the Nazi rise to power. In practice, this change doesn't actually make a difference to the story. Both World War I and World War II saw German U-boats targeting wartime shipping across the Atlantic, and that's as far as the setting really matters. I'm assuming this change was made just because Nazi imagery is much more recognizable to most people than Imperial Germany. A lot more people are going to recognize the Nazi flag than the Imperial German flag. I'm sure that's true for anyone that's not a major history buff, probably even more so in Japan. So, making it a Nazi flag on the submarine hunting British freighters immediately gets across time and place for the story very effectively. Sometime later, U-29 received a communication from headquarters. Their return to shore has been postponed as they are ordered to go after another British ship, the liner Dacia. When they breach for observation, they quickly locate a ship but find something on their deck, a body. Evidently, a crewman from the last ship they sank clung to the side of the submarine, undiscovered until now. The captain coldly tells his crew to dump it overboard. After 2 crewmen named Mueller and Bohm try to pry the man's death grip off the railing, one Lieutenant Cleans decides to loot the body for valuables. He pockets a small statue head he finds in the man's pocket. After they toss the body overboard, Mueller cries out and points, swearing he saw the body swim away, but Cleans thinks he's just seeing things. The weather worsens as the crew goes on. As they are underway, a sailor comes to tell the captain that some of the crew are sick. We see this includes Bohm, who is muttering to himself about the man they found and the dead returning. Carl dismisses it as nervous exhaustion and has them taken off duty. Later, Mueller, clearly suffering some of the same effects, is walking by a porthole when he sees something move. Looking out, he sees a body, the very same body of the British sailor they tossed overboard. It turns and seems to grasp toward him. He screams. When the captain and Lieutenant Cleans find him, Mueller says he saw the sailor again and grabs Cleans, begging him to give back what he took. Cleans strikes him to the ground. As Mueller mumbles, he takes the path of the dead, and he is their lord. The captain orders Cleans to put him in the brig. More time passes, but they've yet to find their target. A crewman comes to inform the captain that Mueller and Bohm have gone missing. He surmises that they jumped ship when last they surfaced, but nobody saw anything. Carl coldly orders their belongings be collected and returns to the search for the Dacia. The search proves fruitless, however, and absent further orders from headquarters, they will return to port, much to the relief of the crew. No sooner does the captain give the order to set course for base, however, than a great thoom rips through the ship. Alarms blare. There has been an explosion in the engine room. They succeed in putting out the fires, but the news is grim. The engine crew are dead. Their fuel is gone. They're on battery power and their steering column is broken. In short, they are dead in the water, but they still have the ability to surface, which they do to get a look around. Thus, on July 2nd, they made contact with the enemy. Sighting an American warship, the captain orders all hands to station and to dive. The crew is reluctant, one officer Traub pointing out there's not much point. They can't maneuver, and when the air and power gives out, they'll just sink into the abyss. They should just surrender. When the officer continues to protest, Carl shoots him. Another crewman comes up to Lieutenant Cleans, telling him to give it back to the sea. He just threatens them with a gun to follow their orders. Thus, U-29 sinks below the waves to escape the enemy, for the last time. Just over a day later, the crew raise a mutiny. The captain is roused by a shot. When he arrives, Lieutenant Cleans is holding the mutineers at gunpoint. They're angry they didn't surrender to the American ship, and they beg the captain to surface. Hopefully someone might still rescue them. Carl is unmoved. You've forgotten your German pride. Sailors of the fatherland do not surrender. Presumably at the captain's orders, Cleans executes the crew. They are alone now, sinking in the deep, trapped in a space no larger than a subway car. The specter of inevitable doom hits Cleans hard. When next we see them, the captain and Cleans are having a meal together. Cleans is bedraggled and drunk, barely recognizing the proper officer he had been before. The captain remains cold and aloof. They contemplate their doom. With the rest of the crew dead, they have plenty of air and food to last a while, but the batteries will run dry first. They'll be in the dark then. The captain continues to chart the drifting submarine's position. With no means of propulsion, they are completely at the mercy of the deep ocean currents. He is attempting to estimate their position by observing their rate of movement relative to the seafloor outside. This goes on for 6 days after the explosion. One day they pass by a sunken ship, not remarkable unto itself, but Cleans swears that the cliff next to it looks sculpted, not a natural formation. He quickly dismisses himself when the captain starts to challenge this, clearly shaken. On the 10th day since the explosion, the captain still hasn't nailed down their position. They are 170 meters below the surface. Cleans is deteriorating further, surrounded by empty bottles and praying for salvation, as Carl looks on coldly. He stares into the blank white eyes of the small statue head as he prays. The submarine continues to drift in the black abyss, the alien expanse of the ocean floor lit only in small patches by its meager searchlights. The captain continues his observations. He calls. Cleans approaches the captain, rambling. He says they should go. Refusing changes nothing. It is best to repent and be forgiven. He takes hold of the captain's hand, but is shaken off. We go together, he says. The captain calls him insane, but Clean says that is a mercy. Pity the man whose callousness keeps him sane. So, beg for his mercy. Go mad. Carl says nothing, but he does put his finger on the trigger of his sidearm. Seeing this, Cleans begs his captain to let him go if he won't come with him. The captain just says to leave the artifact. Cleans just laughs quietly. The captain asks if he has any message to leave for his family. At that, Cleans smiles. I see that you are too sane. Clean steps into, I guess, the internal airlock, and is released into the sea. Carl looks out, hoping to catch sight of Cleans's body, but he doesn't. All he sees are strange dolphins in the darkness of the depths. Now alone, Carl continues his efforts to track the U-boat's position. He determines that the speed of drift has slowed. The seafloor ahead is falling away steeply, and training the submarine's lights ahead, he sees what is unmistakably a building. A great valley of such structures stretches out before him, an entire city of stone. As the submarine drifts down into the valley, Carl is astonished by what he sees. Eventually, the submarine does sink to the bottom, however, coming to rest in the midst of the marine city. Carl can only conclude that he's looking at Atlantis. In a burst of curiosity and a bit of vanity, Carl decides that he, a Reichsdeutscher, should be the first to walk these forgotten halls. Dressing himself in an old diving suit, he exits the U-boat and steps out into the dark city. As he explores the city, Carl realizes that it doesn't seem to have been built for the most part, rather carved directly into the rock. Not to mention many faded, strange figures carved there. He finds a few small artifacts he can carry with him, and catches a glimpse of a grand construction. His light begins to fail before he can approach, however, and he returns to the submarine. The submarine's batteries having failed, Carl examines the artifacts he has found. They appear to be vaguely Hellenic, suggesting to him they belong to some remote ancestor of Greek art. He records all of this in his journal, thinking that someday it might be found by some explorer. He bids they might follow where I could not, and reveal the mystery of a culture that was in the full noon of its glory when cave dwellers roamed Europe, and the Nile flowed unwatched to the sea. As for him, Karl Heinrich watches his last candle sputter and die. He is alone in the utter darkness. With nothing left to occupy himself with before the air and food give out, Carl prepares to kill himself. As he presses the gun barrel to his temple, he notices something, a weak light coming from the portholes. At first he believes that his mind is imagining it, but he can see and touch the glass he was just drinking from. Looking out, he sees light emanating from the openings in the buildings. He hears a strange rhythmic sound coming through the water. For a moment, Carl wonders if he might be perceiving the search beam and beacon of a rescue vessel, but he just as quickly discards the absurd idea. It must be an illusion created by his weakening mind. It cannot be real. Despite this, Karl Heinrich writes a record of what has happened and puts it in a bottle. He exits the submarine for the last time, letting the bottle float up towards the surface. Then he sets his sights on the great edifice he had glimpsed on his last journey. A great luminescence seems to shine from the cavernous entrance now. Atop the entrance, he spies carvings, including a stone face that seems to match the statue head Cleans had taken from the dead British sailor, which seemed so long ago. In his message written earlier, Karl Heinrich concluded that he had gone mad. The things he saw simply could not exist. Despite that, he could not suppress the urge to enter this primal shrine and see for himself the silent secrets of unfathomed waters and uncounted years. And that is the end of our story. The Temple is a fairly early Lovecraft work, and it isn't his best. Some criticisms of the story that carry through to this adaptation include all of the ominous elements like the statue head, the visions of the dead sailor, the weird dolphins. None of them really get satisfactorily tied together. It's sort of head-scratching as to what connection the dead sailor is supposed to have with this place and what they find, unless this is all a hallucination. The dolphins actually get a bit more attention in Lovecraft's story. They swarm around the submarine for most of its journey until just before it arrives at the city. They follow way deeper than dolphins should and never seem to go up for air. That's eerie, but I don't really get how they connect to anything. On a meta level, I can see Lovecraft's idea here. The German U-boat is made to suffer a sort of karmic punishment for their attacks on British ships, but the supernatural elements just don't quite connect into a coherent whole. What I really love about this story, and the art greatly enhances this, is the atmosphere aboard the submarine as it goes on. The sense of isolation and the unseen vastness of the deep ocean are very well communicated in the art, and help the atmosphere as the crew starts to lose their minds. As the situation gets darker, so does the art. More and more we see images of the submarine drifting through the, literally, inky blackness. Then, when it does brighten up again, it's in the carved city, making it feel all the stranger. One problem this adaptation manages to avoid entirely is the inner voice of Karl Heinrich. The story is written in a found document style. That is, the text of the story is ostensibly the message that Karl sent off just before entering the temple. Lovecraft wrote him as basically a satire of an arrogant, aristocratic German officer. His account is littered with his disdainful commentary of pretty much everything that isn't a German aristocrat from the same region of Germany as him. He derides the English pig dogs, he sneers at his crew as commoners, and he in particular calls Lieutenant Cleans a soft, womanish Rhinelander when he hesitates to execute the mutineers. This adaptation tones him down a bit in some other ways. For starters, instead of putting Mueller in the brig, in the original story, Heinrich has him put in chains and whipped. I'm not sure there'd really be room for a whip on a submarine, but I didn't do that much research. He also has 2 other crew executed when they start ranting about the dead and such, to prevent them scaring the rest of the crew. Finally, while in this adaptation Cleans executes the mutineers, in the original story, Cleans hesitates and Karl executes them all himself. All of this comes across as a bit over the top, and it actually undermines the more ominous and eerie tone the story is otherwise going for. In the adaptation, Karl is still a fanatical officer, clearly, but he's portrayed more as coldly removed and callous. His cold non-reactions to the situation actually enhance just how surreal everything starts to feel. They are trapped in a doomed submarine. The entire crew, save 2, are dead, yet he's calmly attempting to track their position as if there were still a chance at rescue. Also in the original story, Carl's actions and his refusal to throw the statue head overboard are what motivate the mutiny, more or less, but not actually the choice to submerge the submarine. In the original story, they actually surface after avoiding the American ship, but are forced to submerge again due to bad weather. Only then do they discover they can't surface. Making them being stuck underwater directly due to his decisions makes for sufficient motivation for the mutiny, without Carl having to be gratuitously cruel. To be clear, I'm not complaining that the German officer is portrayed as a callous bigot, I'm just saying it's distracting rather than adding to the story. One last critique, though it isn't a big one. I think Lovecraft really underestimated how big U-boat crews usually were. As written, it seems like there were scarcely a dozen crew aboard between the few Carl executes, the 2 that jump overboard, and then 6 killed in the mutiny. Then Carl and Lieutenant Cleans are the only 2 left. Now apparently there were some U-boats with crews that small used very early in World War I, but they were mostly used for training by a few years into the war. I am going to hold it against this adaptation's choice to use the World War II setting, however. By then the norm was between 44 and 42 man crews as far as I can tell. That does not matter hugely to this story, and it probably won't get in the way of anyone's enjoyment, but I thought I should mention it. That's all for now. Let me know what you thought of this rather different sort of manga compared to what I usually cover. Otherwise, I hope you have a nice day.